The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine streets of suburban Las Vegas. Officer James Reynolds sat in his police cruiser, sipping his third cup of coffee while his eyes scanned the quiet neighborhood. At 42 years old, Reynolds had spent the last 15 years patrolling these wealthy areas, carrying with him prejudices that ran as deep as the roots of the old oak trees lining the streets. Growing up in a small town where everyone looked the same and thought the same had shaped Reynolds' worldview. Even after moving to the diverse city of Las Vegas, he held on to his biased beliefs like a security blanket. His fellow officers had noticed his attitude during traffic stops, but no one had ever filed a formal complaint, mostly because the wealthy residents of his patrol area rarely caused trouble. That Sunday morning seemed like any other at first. The temperature was already climbing, promising another scorching Nevada day. Reynolds had just finished writing a parking ticket when a sleek, black Ferrari caught his attention. The luxury car pulled into a small convenience store parking lot, its engine purring smoothly before falling silent. Behind the wheel sat a man Reynolds didn't recognize, Mike Tyson, the legendary boxing champion. Tyson was dressed casually in a black t-shirt, his famous facial tattoo visible even from a distance. He had simply stopped to buy a bottle of water before heading to his morning workout session. Reynolds watched through his windshield as Tyson stepped out of the Ferrari. The officer's hand instinctively moved to rest on his belt, his fingers drumming against the hard plastic of his baton. Something about the scene bothered him, though he couldn't have explained why if asked. In his mind, this neighborhood wasn't the place for certain people, regardless of their wealth or status. The convenience store was just opening for the day. Mrs. Chen, the elderly owner, was switching on the lights and setting up the coffee machine. She smiled and waved at Tyson through the window, recognizing him as a regular customer who always greeted her with respect and often bought snacks for the neighborhood kids. Reynolds didn't see any of that. Instead, he saw what his prejudiced mind wanted him to see, a threat to the peace of his patrol area. He put his coffee down and radioed in. "Dispatch, I've got a suspicious vehicle at Chen's Market on Palm Drive. Running plates now." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Copy that, Officer Reynolds. Standing by." Inside the store, Tyson walked to the cooler section, completely unaware of the drama about to unfold. He had lived in Las Vegas for years, was friends with many local business owners, and had never had any problems in this neighborhood. The security cameras silently recorded his movements as he selected a large bottle of water and headed to the counter. Outside, Reynolds had already run the Ferrari's plates. Everything came back clean. The registration was current, no violations, nothing suspicious at all. This should have been the end of it, but Reynolds couldn't let it go. He stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his belt and checking his baton. The morning was still quiet enough that the sound of Reynolds' boots on the asphalt seemed unusually loud. A jogger passed by, slowing down to look at the Ferrari before continuing on their way. A few early birds were starting to chirp in the trees, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh coffee from the store. Mrs. Chen watched through the window as Reynolds approached her store. She had always been wary of this particular officer, having noticed how differently he treated some of her customers. She moved closer to her counter, where she had installed a new security camera just last month. Reynolds paused at the store's entrance, his reflection visible in the glass door. He straightened his badge and adjusted his body camera. Department policy required it to be on during all civilian interactions, though Reynolds had developed a habit of accidentally turning it off during certain encounters. The stage was now set for what would become one of the most talked about incidents in recent Las Vegas history. Inside, Tyson was just reaching for his wallet to pay for his water. Outside, Reynolds was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, and above it all, multiple security cameras were rolling, ready to capture every moment of what would happen next. Officer Reynolds pushed open the convenience store door with more force than necessary, making the bell above it ring sharply. The sound made Mrs. Chen jump behind her counter, where she was just finishing up Tyson's water purchase. Tyson turned his head slightly, keeping his movements calm and measured as he had learned to do over years of being in the public eye. "Sir, step away from the counter and show me some identification," Reynolds barked, his right hand already resting on his baton. His voice carried that special tone some officers use when they already decided there's going to be trouble. Mike Tyson, who had faced down some of the most dangerous fighters in boxing history, simply nodded. "Of course, officer. My wallet is right here in my back pocket. I'm just getting some water." His voice was surprisingly gentle, almost soft, very different from his fierce boxing persona. Mrs. Chen tried to speak up. "Officer Reynolds, Mr. Tyson is a regular customer." "Ma'am, stay out of this," Reynolds cut her off, taking another step forward. His body camera's red light was off, though it should have been on according to department policy. The morning sun streaming through the store windows cast strange shadows across the scene. A young woman who had just pulled up for her morning coffee stood frozen by her car, her phone already out and recording. She recognized Mike Tyson immediately and couldn't believe what she was watching. "Let me see some ID. Now," Reynolds demanded again, even though Tyson was already carefully reaching for his wallet. The officer's hand gripped his Baton tighter, his knuckles turning white. "Sir, I'm moving slowly so there's no misunderstanding," Tyson explained, his eyes steady but non-threatening. He had dealt with prejudice his whole life and had learned patience the hard way. "My wallet is coming out now." Mrs. Chen's security cameras captured everything. Reynolds' aggressive stance, Tyson's careful compliance, and the officer's inexplicable escalation of a routine situation. The morning light caught the sweat beginning to form on Reynolds' forehead, not from fear, but from the anger he was barely containing. As Tyson produced his wallet, Reynolds snatched it from his hand. The former heavyweight champion didn't react to this disrespect, though anyone who knew him could see the supple tightening around his eyes. He remained still, his water bottle still sitting on the counter, paid for but not yet taken. "This your car out front?" Reynolds demanded, flipping through the wallet with shaking hands. When he found Tyson's driver's license, his eyes whitened slightly. He finally realized who he was dealing with, but it only seemed to make him more aggressive. "Yes, sir, the black Ferrari is mine. All the registration and insurance documents are current," Tyson replied calmly. His years of meditation and personal growth had taught him to handle situations like this with patience. Outside, more people had gathered. The young woman with the phone had been joined by others, all recording. Someone in the small crowd whispered, "Is that really Mike Tyson? What's that cop doing?" Reynolds threw the wallet back at Tyson, who caught it smoothly. "Step outside, now." The officer's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. Mrs. Chen, her hands trembling slightly, pressed the silent alarm button under her counter. She had installed it after a robbery last year, but she never thought she'd use it because of a police officer. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being asked to step outside? I've done nothing wrong," Tyson questioned, his voice still steady, but with a hint of steel beneath the politeness. Reynolds' face twisted with barely hidden contempt. Under his breath, but loud enough for both Tyson and Mrs. Chen to hear, he muttered a racial slur that made the store owner gasp. The morning had started so normally, just a simple stop for water before a workout. Now, the air in the small store felt electric with tension. Outside, the crowd had grown to about a dozen people, all with phones raised, all witnessing what was quickly becoming a situation that would shock the nation. Tyson took a deep breath, centering himself as he had learned to do both in and out of the ring. He knew the next few moments would be crucial. As he moved toward the door, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, Reynolds gripped his baton even tighter, pulling it slightly from its holder. The stage was set for what would happen next, a moment that would test both men's character in very different ways. The morning heat was starting to build as Mike Tyson stepped out of the convenience store. The small crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 20 people, their phones recording every moment. The sun glinted off the black Ferrari parked nearby, a stark contrast to Officer Reynolds' dusty police cruiser. Reynolds followed Tyson outside, his baton now fully drawn. The officer's face was red with anger and something else, fear, perhaps, as he realized he had backed himself into a corner. The situation had spiraled far beyond a simple ID check, and deep down, he knew he had made a terrible mistake. "Hands where I can see them," Reynolds shouted, though Tyson's hands were already raised, palms open in a universal gesture of peace. The former champion's face remained calm, but his eyes, those same eyes that had struck fear into countless opponents, were now fixed steadily on the officer. From inside the store, Mrs. Chen was frantically speaking to the police dispatcher. "Please, send someone quickly. Officer Reynolds is harassing Mike Tyson." "Yes, the boxer Mike Tyson. He's acting crazy with his baton out." The growing crowd murmured as Reynolds circled Tyson like a nervous predator that had accidentally cornered something much more dangerous than itself. Someone in the crowd called out, "Hey, that's Mike Tyson. What are you doing, officer?" Reynolds spun toward the voice, shouting, "Stay back. This is police business." His sudden movement caused his body camera to swing on its clip, reminding everyone that its red recording light remained off. Tyson spoke then, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but this situation doesn't need to escalate. I showed you my ID. My car is legally parked. I was just buying water." He gestured slowly toward the store where his unopened water bottle still sat on the counter. A police siren wailed in the distance. Mrs. Chen's silent alarm had worked, but Reynolds seemed beyond hearing it. His prejudices, fear, and anger had created a tunnel vision that blocked out everything except the man in front of him. "I said don't move," Reynolds yelled, though Tyson had barely shifted his weight. The officer's hands were shaking now, making the Baton weave unsteady patterns in the air. Two teenagers on bikes had stopped to watch. One whispered to the other, "Isn't he supposed to call for backup before drawing a weapon?" The other replied, "Man, he doesn't even have his camera on. This is messed up." Tyson remained perfectly still, his boxing instincts telling him exactly how much space lay between him and the officer. He had spent decades learning to read body language, to predict movements before they happened. He could see what was coming, but he hoped he was wrong. "Officer," Tyson said quietly, "I think we both know this isn't right. Let's wait for your backup to arrive." His voice was steady, almost gentle, the voice of a man who had learned to control not just his body, but his emotions as well. Reynolds' response was to spit out another racial slur, loud enough this time for everyone to hear. The crowd gasped. Several people shouted in protest. The siren in the distance grew louder. Mrs. Chen had come to the store's door, her phone still recording. "I have everything on camera, Officer Reynolds. Everything." Something in Reynolds snapped. Maybe it was the crowd's hostile murmurs, or Mrs. Chen's warning, or simply the realization that he had lost control of the situation. His face contorted with rage, and he raised his baton high. Time seemed to slow down. The crowd's shouts became a distant roar. Tyson saw the baton begin its arc toward his shoulder, saw the hatred and fear in Reynolds' eyes, saw the years of prejudice and bias culminating in this one moment of violence. The former heavyweight champion of the world had a choice to make. He could easily dodge the blow. His reflexes were still razor-sharp despite his retirement. He could counterattack. His muscles remembered every punch he'd ever thrown. Or he could stand there and let himself be struck, becoming a victim and a martyr. As the baton whistled through the morning air, 20 phones recorded, 2 security cameras whirred, and Mike Tyson made his decision. The next few seconds would change both men's lives forever. The baton sliced through the air with vicious force, aimed directly at Mike Tyson's left shoulder. In that split second, 30 years of boxing instinct took over. Tyson's body moved with the same liquid speed that had made him the youngest heavyweight champion in history. He shifted his weight slightly, just enough for the baton to whistle past him, missing by less than an inch. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Officer Reynolds, thrown off balance by his wild swing, stumbled forward. "Officer, that was your first and last mistake," Tyson said calmly, his voice carrying across the now silent parking lot. His eyes had changed. There was still control there, but now mixed with the intensity that had once terrified opponents in the ring. Reynolds caught himself and spun around, his face a mask of shocked rage. No one had ever dodged his baton before. His previous victims had either frozen in fear or tried to run, but Tyson just stood there, balanced perfectly on the balls of his feet, hands still raised in a peaceful gesture that somehow looked more threatening than any fighting stance. "Stop resisting," Reynolds screamed, though Tyson hadn't done anything except avoid being hit. The officer raised his baton again, desperation now visible in his movements. The crowd had grown even larger. Someone shouted, "We got it all on video, officer." Another voice called out, "Your body camera's still off." The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the scene, highlighting every movement in stark detail. The second swing of the baton was even wilder than the first. This time, Tyson didn't just dodge. He moved inside Reynolds' swing with the grace of a dancer. In one fluid motion, he caught the officer's wrist with his left hand, controlling the baton. "Listen to me carefully," Tyson said, his voice still eerily calm. "I could end this right now. One punch, just one, and you'd learn why they called me Iron Mike. But I'm not that person anymore. Reynolds tried to pull away, but Tyson's grip was like steel. The officer's other hand moved toward his gun, but Tyson spoke again. Don't. You're being recorded by at least 30 people. Think about your next move very carefully. Mrs. Chen's voice cut through the tension. Backup is almost here. 1 minute away. The sound of sirens was getting closer, but they seemed to belong to another world entirely. Sweat poured down Reynolds' face. His arm trembled in Tyson's grip. The former champion could feel the officer's pulse racing through his wrist. For a moment, their eyes met. Reynolds saw decades of discipline, power, and control in Tyson's gaze, while Tyson saw fear, hatred, and the crumbling of false authority in Reynolds. I'm going to let you go now, Tyson said softly, so only Reynolds could hear. What happens next is your choice. But remember, everyone is watching. Your career, your freedom, your future, it all depends on what you do in the next 10 seconds. The crowd held its breath. Phones remained steady, recording every moment. The security cameras whirred silently. 2 police cruisers turned the corner, lights flashing. Tyson released Reynolds' wrist and stepped back, hands raised again in a peaceful gesture. The officer stood frozen, Baton hanging limply at his side. The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled to its limit. Then Reynolds did something no one expected. He swung the baton one more time, aiming straight for Tyson's head. Time seemed to slow down. The crowd screamed. The backup officers jumped out of their cars. Mrs. Chen covered her eyes, and Mike Tyson moved. It was a single punch, delivered with perfect form. Not the devastating hooks that had won him championships, but a controlled jab to Reynolds' protective vest. Just enough force to stop the attack, to send a message. Reynolds dropped the baton and fell backward, more from shock than pain. He landed hard on the asphalt as his backup finally reached the scene. The morning sun caught the glint of his badge as he sat there, dazed and defeated, while Mike Tyson stood calmly with his hands raised, waiting for the new officers to take control of the situation. The video footage would soon go viral, but the real story was written in the faces of the witnesses. They had just seen 2 kinds of power collide. The false power of prejudice and authority abused, and the true power of discipline and restraint. The next few minutes unfolded like scenes from a movie. 2 police officers, Sergeant Maria Rodriguez and Officer Tom Chen, rushed forward, quickly assessing the situation. Unlike Reynolds, they kept their body cameras on and maintained professional composure as they approached. Mr. Tyson, please keep your hands where we can see them, Sergeant Rodriguez called out calmly. She had recognized him immediately and noticed his controlled stance. We're here to sort this out. Tyson nodded respectfully. Of course, Sergeant. I have about 30 witnesses and multiple camera angles showing everything that happened. His voice was steady, showing no signs of the adrenaline that must have been pumping through his system. Officer Chen helped Reynolds to his feet. The fallen officer's face had turned from red to pale as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. His dropped baton lay on the asphalt like evidence of his shame, and his body camera's unlit indicator seemed to mock him. The crowd had grown even larger. The people maintained a respectful distance. Someone in the back shouted, "We got it all on video," every racist word. Another voice added, "He tried to hit Mike 3 times. Sergeant Rodriguez raised her hand for quiet. Everyone who recorded this incident, please stay here. We'll need your contact information and copies of your videos. She turned to Mrs. Chen, who stood trembling but determined in her doorway. Ma'am, I understand you have security footage. Mrs. Chen nodded vigorously. 2 cameras. Everything is recorded, from the moment he entered my store. Officer Reynolds was very aggressive from the start, and his body camera was off. More police cars arrived, along with 2 news vans that had picked up the incident on their scanners. The morning sun now burned hot overhead, but nobody in the crowd moved to leave. They'd all sensed they had witnessed something important. Tyson finally lowered his hands, with Sergeant Rodriguez's permission. I'd like to press charges, he said quietly. Not for myself, but for everyone else this officer has probably treated this way. The ones who couldn't defend themselves. Officer Chen was securing Reynolds, who had begun to mumble excuses. He was resisting. I felt threatened. But the words sounded hollow, even to himself, as people in the crowd held up their phones, showing the clear evidence of what really happened. A young reporter from one of the news vans approached, but stayed behind the police line. "Mr. Tyson, can you tell us what happened?" she called out. Tyson turned to face the growing media presence, his expression thoughtful. Years of public speaking had taught him the power of choosing his words carefully. "What happened here today is bigger than me," he began. "This is about power and how some people abuse it, but it's also about control, not just physical control, but emotional control." Sergeant Rodriguez was organizing the witness statements, but she paused to listen. Even Reynolds, now sitting in the back of a police car, turned his head to hear Tyson's words. "I could have hurt him badly," Tyson continued, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "The old me would have. But violence only leads to more violence. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show restraint." Mrs. Chen had brought out Tyson's forgotten water bottle. As she handed it to him, her hand still shaking slightly, she whispered, "Thank you for showing us real strength today." The media crews were setting up their cameras, and more police officers had arrived to handle crowd control. The incident was quickly becoming a major news story. Phone videos were already being uploaded to social media, and the hashtag #TysonTeachUsLesson was starting to trend. But amid all the chaos, Mike Tyson remained calm. He gave his statement to Sergeant Rodriguez, provided his contact information, and even signed a few autographs for the backup officers who had acted professionally. The morning that had started with a simple trip for water had turned into something much more significant. A powerful lesson about prejudice, power, and the choice between reaction and response. As the scene continued to unfold, nobody noticed Reynolds in the back of the police car, watching Tyson with a mix of shame and revelation. Sometimes the hardest punches aren't the ones thrown, but the ones held back. By afternoon, the incident had exploded across social media and news channels nationwide. The Las Vegas Police Department's headquarters was surrounded by reporters, their cameras and microphones ready for any official statement. Inside, Chief David Martinez sat in his office, watching the viral videos for the 10th time. "Play Mrs. Chen's security footage again," he told Internal Affairs investigator Sarah Thompson. The footage was crystal clear. Reynolds entering aggressively, his body camera conspicuously off, the racial slurs caught by the store's microphones, and the unprovoked Baton attacks. "Chief, we found something else," Thompson said, opening a thick folder on his desk. "In the past 3 years, we've received 15 complaints about Officer Reynolds. All from minority citizens, all dismissed due to lack of evidence." She spread out the complaint forms, each one telling a similar story of aggression and prejudice. Meanwhile, at the local news station, the young reporter who had first arrived at the scene was reviewing her footage with her editor. "Look at this part," she said excitedly, pointing to her screen. "Tyson could have destroyed him, but he chose not to. That's the real story here." The footage played on screens across the country. Reynolds' 3 attempted attacks, Tyson's controlled defense, and the single, restrained punch that ended the confrontation. Boxing analysts appeared on sports channels, breaking down Tyson's technique and praising his restraint. "In his prime, that punch would have sent someone to the hospital," one analyst explained. "But look how he pulled it back, just enough force to stop the attack. That's not just physical control, that's emotional mastery." Back at the police station, Reynolds sat in an interrogation room, his police uniform replaced by civilian clothes. His union representative sat beside him, looking increasingly uncomfortable as they reviewed the evidence. "Officer Reynolds," Thompson said, her voice professional but cold, "your body camera was off during the entire incident. Can you explain why?" Reynolds stared at the table, his arrogance replaced by defeat. I forgot to turn it on," he mumbled, but everyone in the room knew it was a lie. "We've checked your camera logs," Thompson continued. "It shows a pattern of being turned off during interactions with minority citizens. Would you like to explain that?" Outside the station, a peaceful crowd had gathered. Many held signs supporting police reform, while others carried messages thanking Tyson for his restraint. Mrs. Chen was there too, being interviewed by multiple news stations. "He comes to my store often," she told the reporters, her earlier nervousness replaced by determination. "Mr. Tyson is always respectful, always kind. That officer? He has been trouble for years, but nobody would listen to us before. At his home, Tyson sat with his family, watching the coverage unfold. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Calls from civil rights leaders, police reform advocates, and even the mayor. Everyone wanted to hear his perspective on the incident. "Dad," his teenage daughter asked, "weren't you scared when he attacked you?" Tyson smiled gently. "No, sweetheart. I was sad. Sad that someone with so much power would use it to hurt people. But sometimes life gives you a chance to teach a lesson, not with violence, but with control." The investigation moved quickly. By evening, Chief Martinez had called a press conference. The room was packed with reporters as he stepped up to the microphone. "Today's incident is deeply disturbing," he began, his voice firm. "Officer Reynolds has been suspended without pay pending a full investigation. We've also reopened all previous complaints against him. The Las Vegas Police Department does not tolerate racism or abuse of power." As the chief spoke, more videos emerged online. Other citizens came forward with their own stories about Reynolds, many with evidence they had been afraid to share before. The wall of silence that had protected him for years was crumbling. In the holding cell, Reynolds watched the chief's announcement on TV. For the first time, he saw himself as others saw him, not as a powerful officer of the law, but as a bully who had finally picked the wrong target. The bruise on his chest where Tyson had struck him was nothing compared to the wound to his pride and career. 1 week after the incident, the Las Vegas courthouse was packed with people. Former Officer James Reynolds sat at the defendant's table, wearing a gray suit that seemed too big for him now. His arrogance had disappeared, replaced by the haunted look of a man watching his life unravel. District Attorney Maria Gonzalez stood before the judge, her voice clear and confident. "Your Honor, we are charging Mr. Reynolds with assault, civil rights violations, and misconduct under color of authority. The evidence is overwhelming." The courtroom screen showed a compilation of videos from that morning: Mrs. Chen's security footage, witness phone recordings, and videos from nearby buildings. Each angle told the same story of unprovoked aggression and racial bias. In the gallery, Mike Tyson sat quietly with his lawyer. He had been called as the star witness. This case had grown far beyond just his experience. Behind him sat 12 other people, Reynolds' previous victims who had finally found the courage to come forward. "The prosecution calls Sarah Thompson from Internal Affairs," the DA announced. Thompson walked to the witness stand, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Miss Thompson," Gonzalez began, "please tell the court what your investigation revealed about Mr. Reynolds' pattern of behavior." Thompson opened her folder. "We found 37 incidents over the past 5 years where Officer Reynolds turned off his body camera during encounters with minority citizens. 23 complaints were filed, but all were dismissed due to lack of evidence that would have existed if his camera had been on." Reynolds sank lower in his chair as Thompson continued. "We also discovered that he falsified reports in 15 cases, claiming resistance or aggressive behavior from citizens when none existed." Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding police reform, but this wasn't an angry mob. Many off-duty police officers stood among them, wearing "Good Cops Against Bad Cops" t-shirts. The incident had sparked an important conversation within the department itself. Back inside, Mrs. Chen took the stand. Her voice shook slightly, but her words were clear. "I installed those security cameras because I was afraid, not of robbers, but of officers like him. That morning, when he attacked Mr. Tyson, I finally had proof of what we have been trying to tell people for years." During a break in the proceedings, reporters cornered Police Chief Martinez in the hallway. "Chief, how will the department prevent similar incidents in the future?" Martinez, who had aged years in the past week, spoke with determination. "We're implementing mandatory psychological evaluations, expanding our bias training, and most importantly, any officer who turns off their body camera during an encounter will face immediate suspension." The afternoon session began with Mike Tyson's testimony. The former champion walked to the stand with the same calm dignity he had shown during the incident. Reynolds couldn't meet his eyes. "Mr. Tyson," the DA said, "please tell the court why you chose to press charges." Tyson leaned forward slightly. "I could have walked away. I could have forgotten about it. But then I thought about all the people who couldn't defend themselves like I could. This wasn't about me getting hit. It was about making sure it never happens to anyone else." As he spoke, several of Reynolds' other victims nodded silently. One elderly man wiped away tears. It all found strength in Tyson's example. The evidence continued to mount. An expert testified about Reynolds' pattern of turning off his camera. A police trainer explained how Reynolds had violated multiple protocols. A psychologist discussed how power and prejudice can corrupt authority. By day's end, Reynolds' lawyer was already discussing plea bargain options. The evidence was too strong, the witnesses too credible, and the public attention too intense to risk a full trial. In the courthouse parking lot, reporters surrounded Tyson as he left. "Mr. Tyson, do you feel vindicated?" Tyson paused thoughtfully. "This isn't about vindication, it's about change. Sometimes it takes one clear example to show a bigger truth. I hope this case helps good police officers do their jobs better and helps departments remove officers who abuse their power." As the sun set behind the courthouse, the day's events had made one thing clear: the impact of that morning at Mrs. Chen's store would be felt for years to come. Real change was happening, not through violence or revenge, but through justice and truth.